In today's episode, a group of stranded Arctic explorers are attacked by the Arctic's top predator, the polar bear. One of the men is pulled into the water and taken to a nearby ice sheet to be devoured, eaten alive in front of his crewmates. Hit that like button and subscribe right now. This is the terrifying Arctic voyage of Willem Barents, one of the worst polar bear attacks of all time. Welcome to Final Affliction. In the late 1500s, Dutch explorer Willem Barents set out on 3 expeditions to the frozen north. His aim was to find a northeast polar passage connecting Europe to China. He left his native home of Holland and traveled northwards over Scandinavia and then east to the Barents Sea, named after him. It would open a valuable trade route, saving time shipping cargo between the 2 destinations. But his expeditions were fraught with challenges and obstacles, not least of all, the inhospitable environment of the Arctic. Twice, Willem had to turn their boat back around and head for home when they reached dead ends. But on the 3rd expedition, they managed to carve their way further along the proposed route until disaster struck. On September 11th, 1596, Willem and his crew were trapped by pack ice surrounding the boat. They couldn't go forwards, and they couldn't go back. They were stuck, frozen on the ice sheets drifting around the sea. They would have to endure a winter in one of the most inhospitable places on Earth. They decided to build a cabin on the ice, a place where they could stay during the winter. Conditions were brutal in the Arctic. For 4 months over the winter, the sun doesn't rise above the horizon. The constant dusk-like light makes it difficult to distinguish night from day. Equally, the cold is almost unbearable. It averages -30 degrees Celsius, -22 Fahrenheit, a bone-chilling cold that is inescapable. As their supplies dwindled, they were forced to venture further to find driftwood to keep fires going. They salvaged what they could from the boat and trapped and ate Arctic foxes to preserve their food supply. If being trapped in an ice sheet in the ocean isn't scary enough, they were plagued by polar bears. They were very curious. Some climbed onto their boat. Some scratched at their hut, trying to find a way in. The polar bears were a constant fear for everyone. Their first sighting of one of those impressive animals made an impression on the crew. They tried to capture it so they could take it back to Holland to show people. They lassoed the bear, but it became apparent that handling a full-grown polar bear on a confined ship was a death wish. In the end, they killed it and planned to take the pelt back home. The crew found it difficult to kill the polar bears. Shooting them often only maimed the animals and made them more dangerous. It seemed like pain fueled the animals' rage. But despite them being hard to kill, they managed to take some of them down and used their fat to power their lanterns, providing light in an otherwise dark land. The meat they were able to cut from the bears was enough to last the entire winter, and it was a lot better tasting than the Arctic foxes. However, on one occasion they ate the polar bear's liver, which almost killed the entire crew. A well-known fact now, but unknown to the men at the time, was that polar bear liver has such a high level of vitamin A that eating it can be fatal. Symptoms of polar bear liver poisoning depend on the amount of liver consumed, but usually include weakness, vomiting, diarrhea, drowsiness, headaches, hair loss, bone pain, peeling skin, and blurred vision. If someone eats too much polar bear liver, symptoms include full-body skin loss, hemorrhaging, coma, and death. Scurvy was also a constant battle for the men. Their bodies were unwashed, and the stench inside the hut enticed the polar bears even more. A small group left the hut and went to search for driftwood. Nothing grew in the frozen land. There were no trees or shrubs, no vegetation that they could burn to keep their fire going, to keep them warm and to cook on. Instead, they had to scavenge from their boat and from what the sea brought them. They hiked for miles, carrying with them a sled that they could load up. It was hard work trudging through the ice and snow. They were ill-prepared for the conditions. They hadn't anticipated having to leave their ship. They had no snowshoes and no warm winter clothing. As they walked closer to the open sea, the ice became thinner. It became more and more broken up. Sometimes the men had to step from one floating island of ice to the next. It was dangerous. One bad move, one slip, and they would fall into the water. Hypothermia would set in within seconds. They wouldn't stand a chance. But there were worse dangers out there than hypothermia. Polar bears continued to be on the prowl. The men knew the dangers they faced. They saw how aggressive the bears could be and how powerful they were. Their initial awe of the animals had long since worn off. Now they were terrified by their existence. As they stepped onto a floating island of ice, something caught their eyes. In the distance, something moved, white against white. It was a polar bear, and it was interested in them. As it walked, the men could see its characteristic lumbering gait, the way its head swung gently from side to side as it ambled towards them. The men raised their guns, but they knew from experience that it was very difficult to kill a polar bear. Unless it was a direct shot into its skull, the bullet would only injure it, causing it to become more aggressive. At that time, the polar bears were curious of people. They hadn't yet learned to fear them, and as a predator that is constantly on the lookout for an opportunistic meal, it was dangerous. They had lived as the apex predators of the Arctic for centuries. They knew no different. The bear continued to close the gap between them. It didn't run, it didn't charge, but it made steady progress. When it was just 20 feet away, it stopped and raised its head skywards, sniffing the air. The men hoped it would turn back. They hoped it would see the group of them as a threat and turn away. But without warning, the polar bear went from a complete standstill to a full-on charge in a millisecond. Reaching speeds of up to 25 miles per hour, polar bears can easily outrun a human. It closed the gap between them in seconds. The men leapt across to another floating island of ice. When the bear reached the edge of the ice, it slipped into the water and disappeared from sight. The men huddled together, looking over the edge into the icy water. Where had the bear gone? Maybe it had given up. Maybe it had swum underneath them and continued swimming. But just then, to their horror, the polar bear popped up beside the ice. Its fur slicked down with the water, its enormous head peering over the top of the iceberg. Then, with one huge paw, it swiped at the men. It caught one of them with its 3.5-inch, 9-centimeter-long claws and dragged him kicking and screaming into the water. The other men fired their guns, but in the commotion and the chaos, they missed. They then watched as the bear dragged their companion out of the water and onto the nearby ice. They could see the man was still alive. He was struggling to breathe, coughing and spluttering as the bear bit down on his skull. They heard the crack of bone, the crunch from the bear's powerful jaws. Then their friend fell silent. The men were trapped on the island of ice. They endured the torture of having to watch their friend being devoured by the bear, blood spilling onto the pristine white snow. The bear lifted its head. Its muzzle had turned red as it turned to look at the rest of the crew. Were they going to be next? They were in a conundrum. Should they stay still, waiting for the bear to finish its meal and leave? Or should they make a break for it whilst the bear was distracted? Every time they tried to move, the bear stopped eating and looked up. It may be more aggressive now that it was protecting its kill. No one knew what to do. Very slowly, the men inched away. They never took their eyes off the bear as they crept back towards the relative safety of their hut and fellow crewmates. When they made it back to the hut, shaken and traumatized, they crawled inside and delivered the devastating news to the rest of the crew. That night, they had to endure the terrifying sounds of a polar bear scratching at the roof of the hut, trying to break through, trying to catch its next meal. They were terrified the door would burst down at any moment and they'd be the next to get eaten alive. How long could they endure this torture? It would be 10 months before the men could depart the frozen Arctic. By the following June, the sea ice had melted enough for them to begin their journey home. They had spent almost a year in the grueling Arctic conditions. Their ship was irreparable, but they managed to sail 2 smaller boats southwards back towards Holland. They made it to Kola Bay, just north of Scandinavia, hungry and weak, still in the same clothes they had been in 10 months earlier. They boarded a Dutch ship which sailed them down to Holland, but Willem didn't make it. He died on the journey. His final expedition had come to a sad end. Of the 17 crew to set out on the venture, only 12 made it home to their families, many of them having witnessed one of the worst polar bear attacks of all time, a polar bear dragging their friend into the ocean and onto a sheet of ice, eating him alive as he slowly succumbed to his final affliction.